The painting you are looking at right now has hung in a museum in the Netherlands for decades. Millions of people have stood in front of it. Art historians have written about it. Students have studied it. Tourists have photographed it and moved on. And yet it was only in 2015 that a researcher noticed something hidden inside it that had been sitting in plain sight for more than 100 years. Something that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Something that completely changes what this painting actually is and what Van Gogh was actually doing when he made it. The painting is called Café Terrace at Night. Van Gogh painted it in September of 1888 in the French town of Als. Today it hangs at the Kröller-Müller Museum in Otterlo, and it is considered one of the masterworks of post-impressionism. Most people who encounter it feel a certain warmth from it, a kind of golden, glowing peace. They look at it and they think, a beautiful evening, a quiet street, stars above a French café. They are not wrong, but they are also not seeing what is there, because buried inside this painting, hidden not in shadow, not in some obscure corner, but directly in the center of the composition where anyone could find it, Van Gogh placed something that no one was supposed to miss and almost everyone did. But before we get there, we need to go back, much further back. Look at the painting for a moment the way most people look at it. A cobblestone street in the south of France, still warm from the day's heat. A café terrace spilling golden light outward onto the stone. Tables occupied by figures in the easy, unhurried posture of people with nowhere they need to be. A waiter moving among them, white-aproned, unhurried. And above it all, a sky so deep and blue it almost vibrates, scattered with stars that seem to pulse rather than simply shine. It is, at first glance, a scene of ordinary beauty. The kind of evening that needs no explanation and carries no hidden weight. Just life as it is lived, lit warmly from within, open to the sky above. This is what most people see. This is what most people have always seen. And in one sense, that reaction is exactly right. Van Gogh was not a painter who despised the surface of things. He loved the surface. He loved cobblestones and candlelight and the way gaslight fell across a wet street at night. He painted the world with a tenderness that sometimes looked like desperation, as though he was afraid it might disappear before he could get it down. But Van Gogh was also never painting only what he saw. He was always painting what he meant. And the two things for him were never entirely separate. To understand what he buried inside this canvas, and why, we first need to understand the man who made it. Because the hidden detail inside Café Terrace at Night did not come from nowhere. It came from the whole of his life. Vincent van Gogh was born in 1853 in the Netherlands, the eldest surviving son of a Protestant pastor. Faith was not simply something his family practiced. It was the air inside the house. It was the organizing principle of everything. And from early on, Vincent absorbed it completely. Before he ever picked up a brush, his deepest and most consuming ambition was not to make art. It was to preach the gospel, to serve, to reach people who were suffering and bring them something that would help them bear it. In his mid-20s, he went to work as a missionary in the Borinage, a coal mining region in southern Belgium. What he found there appalled him. The miners and their families lived in conditions of grinding poverty, malnutrition, and exhaustion. And Van Gogh, who could have kept a comfortable distance as their spiritual advisor, instead did something that shocked everyone around him. He gave away his own clothes. He slept on the floor of a small hut. He nursed the sick. He made himself as poor as the people he had gone to serve, because he could not find it in himself to speak to them about suffering from a position of comfort. The church dismissed him, not because he had failed in his mission, but because, in their judgment, he had taken his sense of duty too far. He had made himself undignified. He had confused the role of a minister with the role of a servant. That dismissal broke something in him. He was 27 years old, and the vocation that had organized his entire inner life had been taken away from him, not by his own failure, but by the institution he had given everything to serve. It was only after that rejection that he turned to painting. And here is the thing that most people get wrong about that turn. It was not an escape from his faith. It was not a secular pivot, a man who had lost God and found art instead. Van Gogh himself was clear about this in his letters. He had come to believe that a painting could reach a person the way a sermon never had. That you could say something true and necessary about human life through color and brushwork that no amount of preaching from a pulpit could deliver. That art was, as he understood it, simply preaching by another name. He painted workers, peasants, potato farmers with rough hands eating their evening meal by lamplight. Ordinary people, painted with a rawness that scandalized the refined art world of his time. That was precisely the point. He wanted the viewer to feel they were standing in the same room as something real. By 1888, he had left Paris, overwhelmed by its noise and its social exhaustion, and arrived in Alès in the south of France, chasing sunlight and silence and space to work. And in Alès, something inside him opened completely. Over 14 months, he produced more than 200 paintings. He wrote constantly to his brother Theo, describing what he was seeing, what he was feeling, what he was trying to say. He painted with an urgency that the people around him found difficult to understand, as though he were racing against something he could feel but couldn't name. He had never stopped preaching. He had only changed the pulpit. Before we reach what Van Gogh hid inside this painting, we need to spend a moment with how he made it. Because the craftsmanship of Café Terrace at night is itself a kind of argument, evidence of a painter so precise, so deliberate, so committed to intention in every single stroke, that nothing inside it can be dismissed as accidental. The first thing to notice is what is not there. Van Gogh painted this entire night scene without using the color black anywhere in it. Not once. He wrote to his sister Wilhelmina directly about this choice, explaining that he wanted to move completely away from the conventional idea of night as something heavy and dark and oppressive. He wanted to show night as it actually felt to him, luminous, alive, filled with color rather than emptied of it. The blazing yellow of the café lantern burning against the deep violet blue of the sky is not simply a decorative contrast. It is a statement. Warmth and light, Van Gogh was insisting, are always present. Even in the darkest hours. You only have to look for them in the right way. He also painted this on location. Not the next morning from memory, not from sketches made earlier and reconstructed in a studio. He set his easel directly in front of the café, on the cobblestones, and painted the entire scene under the actual gaslight of the evening, working in the dark he was depicting. He told Theo in a letter that it amused him enormously to paint the night right there in the night itself. And then there are the stars. The constellations scattered across the sky above the café terrace are not invented. They are not approximate. Astronomers have confirmed that what Van Gogh painted in the sky above Alès that evening is an exact match to how the sky actually appeared on the night of September 16, 1888. He was not decorating a sky with generic points of light. He was documenting, with a precision that feels almost scientific, exactly what was above him as he stood there painting. Think about what that means. No black paint, painted live under real gaslight, astronomically accurate stars. Every cobblestone in the street individually rendered. Every brushstroke visible and deliberate. This is not a man who left things to chance. This is not a man who filled a canvas with approximate impressions and called it finished. So the question worth holding as we move forward is simply this. Do you believe that a painter this precise, this intentional about every single verifiable detail in this image, would have placed anything else inside it without meaning exactly what he placed? Now look again at the painting. Not at the terrace, not at the sky, not at the cobblestones glowing under the lantern light. Look at the interior of the café in the background. Through the open doorway, behind the brightness of the terrace itself, there are figures gathered inside. Count them. There are 12 of them. Seated, arranged around a table, grouped in the posture of people sharing a meal together. And at the center of that group, not seated but standing among them, is a single figure wearing a white tunic with long hair. Look directly above that central figure. Visible in the window frame immediately behind him, clearly present and unmistakable once you see it, is the shape of a cross. And now look to the left of the doorway, slightly apart from the group. Moving away from the table, stepping out of the café and into the dark street beyond, is a single dark figure. Alone. Already leaving. One standing central figure in white, 12 gathered around him, a cross positioned directly above his head, and one figure slipping away alone into the shadows. Van Gogh had hidden the Last Supper inside a French cafe. Christ at the table, the 12 apostles arranged around him, and Judas already gone. Now, a claim this extraordinary requires more than a compelling visual argument, and Van Gogh provides it himself through his own letters. Writing to his brother Theo at exactly the time he was working on Café Terrace at night, Van Gogh described feeling what he called a tremendous need and then paused, searching for the word, for religion, not for a church, not for theology, for something deeper than either of those. And in another letter written just before he began the painting, he mentioned a work by the Belgian painter Charles de Gogh, a solemn scene of peasants gathered at a table in the manner of the Last Supper, saying that image had come back to his mind again, that it was sitting inside him as he worked. The evidence is not circumstantial. It is layered, deliberate, and confirmed by the painter's own hand. The man who had wanted above everything to be a preacher, who had given away his clothes and slept on floors for his faith, who had been turned away by the very church he had sacrificed everything to serve, that man had found his way back to the story that mattered most to him. And he had placed it not in a cathedral, not on an altarpiece, not somewhere grand and official and sanctioned. He had placed it inside an ordinary cafe on a warm September evening, under a sky full of real stars, on a street where anyone might walk past. What Van Gogh did inside this painting was not simply an act of artistic cleverness. It was a theological statement, and it was a personal one. Here was a man who had been told, by the institution that claimed to own the sacred, that he was not fit to serve it, that his way of practicing faith, too raw, too close, too willing to get on the floor alongside suffering, was undignified, unsuitable, too much, and so he found another way. He took the most sacred meal in Christian history, the final gathering of Christ and his disciples before the crucifixion, the meal that has been painted by the greatest artists in Western civilization, placed in the grandest churches, treated as almost too holy to approach, and he put it inside a French cafe, under gaslight, on a cobblestone street, surrounded by ordinary people having an ordinary evening. What he was insisting, quietly and without a single word of explanation, was something radical. That the sacred is not somewhere else. It is not locked inside churches or preserved inside institutions that get to decide who is worthy of it. It is not elevated above ordinary life, looking down from a safe distance. It is here. It has always been here, in the middle of the evening, at an ordinary table under a sky full of real stars, visible to anyone who is willing to look past the surface of things. Van Gogh had spent his entire life trying to close the distance between the holy and the human. As a missionary, he had tried to do it with his body, sleeping on floors, giving away his coat. As a painter, he had tried to do it with color and light. And in Café Terrace at night, on a warm September evening in 1888, he did it with something hidden inside an image that millions of people would one day stand in front of and simply see a beautiful street. He had preached his sermon. He had placed it in plain sight, and he had trusted that eventually, someone patient enough to really look would find it. All it ever required was someone patient enough to look. Thank you for watching until the end. I want to ask you 2 questions, and I genuinely want to know what you think. The first, had you ever noticed those figures inside the cafe before today? Had that central figure, or the cross above him, or the lone figure slipping away into the street? Had any of that ever caught your eye before someone pointed it out? And the second, which I think is the more interesting question, do you believe Van Gogh planned every one of these details deliberately? Did he sit in front of that cafe on that September evening and consciously construct a hidden Last Supper inside it, layer by layer, figure by figure? Or is it possible that some things simply flow through a painter's hand, that the story he had carried inside him for 30 years found its own way onto the canvas without him ever fully deciding to put it there? Leave your answer in the comments. I read them, and that particular question has no clean answer, which is exactly why it is worth asking. See you in the next video.